At the KIPP DC College Preparatory School in Washington, D.C., they're not taking any chances. Deep cleaning is underway. Since April, the KIPP schools, a collection of 7 charter campuses, has been following CDC guidelines closely. It's expanded its janitorial staff by 10%, invested in high-tech cleaning machines and touchless sinks, and purchased 76 gallons of hand sanitizer and 26,000 containers of disinfecting wipes for classrooms.
We are spending between $500,000 and $750,000 per campus.
Although publicly funded, the KIPP schools say they're able to pay for COVID cleaning because they're privately run and had the ability to reallocate funds on short notice when the pandemic hit, a flexibility many traditional public school systems lacked. But even if they could reallocate funds, the price of COVID cleaning for public schools is high. According to the School Superintendents Association, an average-sized public district of 3,700 students can expect $1.8 million in pandemic-related costs for the coming year. In big city public school systems, the price tag's much higher.
We are anticipating spending an additional $60 to $80 million in preparation.
Superintendent of Philadelphia Public Schools, William Haidt, says without additional federal funding, his district will be hard-pressed to afford new CDC-recommended COVID cleaning measures without making painful cuts to other parts of the school system.
If those monies don't come through, we would be looking at staff layoffs, including teacher layoffs.
Philadelphia public school teachers Helen Wilkes and Courtney Love worry the district won't succeed in COVID-proofing their classrooms when it still hasn't made good on years-old promises to rid aging schools like theirs of mold, lead, and asbestos.
We do not have enough resources for a complete cleanup by the guidelines.
Just during a regular school day, there's not enough paper towels, there's no soap. I have students and myself, we bring in our own toilet paper and tissues, and I always have my own cleaning supplies.
Back in Washington, KIPP school administrators say they consider themselves lucky to be able to invest in COVID deep cleaning. The return on their investment won't be measured in dollars, but they say something more.
We have staff that are excited and willing to come back to school, and we have students and families excited to do the same.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.